What up, people? Super happy and excited to have a good friend of mine and somebody super interesting to have join on the show today. We've got Zhuang Lim dialing in from Singapore. Zhuang, do you prefer to go by Zhuang or Hong Zhuang?
Just one is fine. Yeah.
Just Zhuang? Okay.
Just
Well,
one, yeah.
little background on Zhuang. Zhuang is the CEO of Shuttle One. He also, interestingly enough, used to be a farmer, actually currently still is a farmer and an agricultural investor. He started off his career at, I think, at Goldman Sachs in London, and he's also pretty well known in the crypto space, especially in Southeast Asia, because, am I correct, you were Singapore's first Bitcoin miner?
Ethereum. Yeah, we are
Ethereum
one
miner,
of the
okay.
largest over here. Yeah.
Got it, got it. Well, yo, Zhuang, thanks so much for taking the time again. Uh,
Pleasure.
you've got a wide range of interests and ventures, and seems like you've got your fingers in a lot of different pies. Just tell us a little bit about what your story is, and maybe a little bit about Shuttle One as well too.
Sure. I think thanks, Alex, for this. I've always been, for the most part, the last 10 years, an entrepreneur. So I've started a few things, primarily in the food business, in agriculture. So I graduated in Singapore at the last crisis, I was the next graduating batch after Lehman crash in that sense. So, but thank God, I've got a stint, at Goldman, the investment bank in London. But it was changing, right? Finance was changing, and it was getting pretty tough for the bank itself, right? Regulations were coming in, people were complaining, why, certain things are happening and all that. So I decided to come back to Southeast Asia, came back to Singapore, had a thought, and decided, hey, food is going to be the most important thing in any crisis in that sense. So I went up to Malaysia. I started a farm, which eventually became almost 300 acres of fresh produce. So things like your vegetables, your eggplants, your chilies, and all that were stuff that I planted. Manage a bunch of workers that are mostly foreign labor from Indonesia, from Bangladesh. So that was the most part of the next 10 years. Somewhere there, I had a buyout. Some guys from China and Hong Kong actually invested in us. And I stayed on for a couple of years and until I got to know Ethereum in that sense. So we started to be miners. We did the whole works, right, Alex? From
How did you find out
ICO.
about Ethereum, by the way?
So a friend of mine, very good college friend of mine, came on, one night, and he said, he needed a place for all these computers. And I'm like, dude, are you opening a LAN shop, an internet cafe? And he was like, no. I'm thinking of mining this, Ethereum thing. And that sparked my thought. That was 2016, 2017. I got in touch with Bitcoin in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
I started to read about it. I thought I was late. And I was like, wow, this thing we can use, computers to actually process some transactions and so on. I didn't do anything back in 2013, but I did mine Dogecoins for a while.
Nice.
So when my friend, who is a serious guy, I knew him for many years, and he came and said, I'm going to do this Ethereum thing. I'm like, dude, you are one of the most conservative guy that I know, and you are doing this, So he came to my office. He asked me if I have space for 10 computers. Obviously I said yes. And that got me hooked on what Ethereum is. That got me to dive deeper into what crypto is and all that. And we went through the works, 16, 17, you and us, we participated in some projects together in that sense. But actually, when the summer of 2018 came along, we asked ourselves, who are we? Are we truly investors? Are we venture capitalists? Or we like to brand ourselves as the new age venture caps, right? Eventually, we thought we are not. And we think that essentially we are builders, we are entrepreneurs. So why don't we go back to whatever that we know to build something, build a product, build a company. And that's how Shuttle One came about, right? So it started around the fall of 2018. We took a couple of months to figure it out, whether that was the go-to-market. What is the products? Are our products really good? Will somebody use it in that sense? So fast forwarded to today, our remittance product was out sometime in December last year. So we started to churn a bit more transactions from a month-to-month basis. We are growing about 2x month-on-month now, which is okay, but essentially, we decided that it's got to be more. It's got to be an integrated financial platform. Obviously everything's settled by blockchain, by crypto in that sense. So and we see the impact, right? We see the impact on cheaper, faster transactions. We see the impact of loan disbursement that is more efficient in that sense. And we're building business from here. So that's the long and short about what we are doing right now.
Got it. Sorry. So for some of the people that don't know, Shuttle One is a payments platform. I mean, can you get into it a little bit as to sort of
So
what?
Shuttle One is a payments platform. That is one way to look at us. But essentially, we are a integrated financial platform where we build all the financial services on cross-border technologies like the blockchain in that sense, or in this case, Ethereum in that sense. So we transact on the Ethereum blockchain using stable coins, where the digital asset is non-volatile. It's not like Bitcoin that goes up and down. So we feel truly that it is crypto that is truly cross-border. And one way that we are changing how remittances work is that because there is value in the token itself, our partners some of them are financial institutions, they don't need to provide these financial instruments that locks up their working capital, and that's where it makes it more efficient, where we pass on the cost savings to users at the end of the day.
Got it. So I mean, would you say Shuttle One, to make an analogy, is more of a digital bank, or is it more of a transfer-wise using crypto as the underlying mechanism? What would you say is the closest sort of analogy?
I mean, I think in this day and age, it's definitely a digital bank. We do remittances, we do loans, we handle personal finance, in a decentralized and trustless manner. But I would be careful again not to link that together, because there are regulatory concerns which we are also concerned about, right? There are a lot of regulations, laws that are not clear, especially in our region. And banking denotes that you need a banking license in that sense. So we are careful, but definitely, we do support in these three basic financial services that is built on the blockchain in that sense.
And the target audience, demographic, geographical location is mostly ASEAN, right? Which is Southeast Asia.
ASEAN, yeah. Southeast Asian nations. That's right. Yeah.
Got it. So that's super interesting, Zhuang. Thanks for that. And speaking about Southeast Asia, one of the things that I personally am quite interested in is a number of things, right? Obviously, I think that for people outside of the region, there's been quite a lot of dare I say, hype or excitement because of the fact that it has such an interesting demographic. Something like 70% of the country is younger than 35. It's obviously a huge part of the global population. It's something like 650 million all total, close to 750 if I'm not mistaken. And so there's a lot of interesting things and exciting things happening out of there. Obviously, some of the new unicorns, Gojek, Tokopedia, what have you. And given this climate of slowing global growth, I believe it's one of the few regions in the world, if not the only one, that will actually be forecasted to eke out a tiny bit of growth in 2020. So tell us a little bit about the state of, not just crypto, but just fintech and technology, just generally in the space. What are you seeing there? What has been, I guess, the momentum thus far, and how have things maybe changed in the past couple months?
I think technology-wise, the US or the West would always be stellar, right? The huge market in terms of adoption. I mean, if you look at Venmo, Stripe, Stripe just raised 600 million, just like that, in that sense. So from a fintech point of view, we compete globally. Although I like to say we are lovely as a region in that sense. So from a tech point of view, there are a lot of players who are in Southeast Asia. it's not just the homegrown Southeast Asian unicorns. It's not just the Grabs or the Gojek, Stripe, eBay, PayPal. They're all here in that sense.
Yeah, Singapore
Mostly,
is usually like the Asia headquarters for a lot of these massive publicly traded companies too.
yeah, they are all here. And financials, the Chinese guys, they are all here too. In Southeast Asia, doing whatnot, Alipay, whatever pay that you have, they are all here in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that denotes a importance of Southeast Asia. I think in from a regional point of view, you're right. There are 650 million people. In all the Southeast Asian nations, of which I think 50% or slightly more than 50% are under the age of 35. So we are young. Generation Z, new millennials, definitely here in the region. Politically, I think we are a bit more stable as compared to other comparable regions. We are still a developing region, right? In that sense,
Right.
You can consider Singapore developed, sure, but out of I think the 13 ASEAN nations, Southeast Asian nations, only Singapore is classified as a developed nation.
Right.
So competition is good. Growth would not be crazy. I don't think it's like Latin America or some people would tell me Africa being almost non-existent in this tech space would be a better region for growth. But we cherish stability, and therefore there comes the competition.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, certainly, if we just take a look at sovereign debt and sort of risk associated with that as just a barometer, right? I mean, I would definitely put some of the Southeast Asian countries a little bit above, definitely Latin American countries and for sure African countries as well too. And so, on that, what do you think some of the misconceptions are, if any, that exist about sort of Southeast Asia, and where do you think some of those opportunities that people aren't necessarily seeing, and where are some of the traps as well too?
I think when people look at Southeast Asia, it's just like when people look at China, especially from the West, they love to come to Hong Kong first, and in Hong Kong they feel at home, right? Because Hong Kong has always been a very expat place and all that. So when it's in the same light, when people explore Southeast Asia, it's always Singapore first. Although we know Thailand, we know Bali, we will know KL, maybe Manila, but being in Singapore as a first base, that's great, but people always get the misconception that Singapore is just Southeast Asia in that sense, but rather a lot of friends that I know, especially the guys that come from overseas, and maybe sometimes even the Chinese, they tend to overlook the need for localization, right? In Southeast Asia, there are more than 60 different minority cultures. There are 54 different languages in that sense. So of course, when you get to Thailand, you speak Thai, but there are many subsets of Thai, for example. Just like when you come to Malaysia, you speak Bahasa Melayu or Malay in short, but the Bahasa in Indonesia is different from the one in Malaysia in that sense. So, we have to get this localization correct. And this is one thing that people always get wrong, that when they come to Singapore, they feel, this is Southeast Asia, is great, I'm at home. But when they start to expand outwards, the different cultures, the different working relations, with people in a sense, that causes, some turn off in a sense. So be prepared when you come to our region, hyper localization, understanding cultures, not from a touristy point of view, right? I think that would be more important for friends trying to come to the region.
Fair enough. And on that, what sort of opportunities do you see, not just from, well, I guess we could start from Shuttle One and kind of how you're positioning your company, but also just for the industry as a whole, whether that's crypto, whether that's fintech, just generally.
So interesting, we just did I think a horizontal and vertical study of the crisis, and how it impacts firstly our partners, and then how do we shift strategies and in wider as a whole. So it's 3 points. The first thing is every crisis in the last 20 odd years, or in general, every crisis changed a very specific social behavior in that sense. So we start off from 911, right? When, although it's not in Southeast Asia, when 911 happened, the World Trade Centers were attacked.
Mm-hmm.
It changed the way we travel. If you were traveling before that, going through airport security and all that was such a breeze.
Yeah.
Now we have to carry 100 ml of liquids. We have to come up, sometimes 3 hours in advance, especially in the US. Going to the US is not easy, right? For checks and balances. So 911 changed something. It changed the way we travel. Two, we saw the SARS outbreak in 2003, especially in Hong Kong, where you guys are right now. I remember my years in Hong Kong. The Hong Kongers, Hong Kong friends were very uptight about getting into elevators, because I remember people were talking about, oh, SARS could be spread by aerosols, face-to-face contact, which is all true, right? But Hong Kong had a very heightened sense they're very sensitive to even long after the SARS outbreak. If you go to elevators today, I'm sure you will still see notices that says, this elevator is clean, how many hours.
Disinfected every hour or something, yeah.
This is very specifically Hong Kong, right? Especially in public spaces. So it also changed the way how certain, I guess, Northeast Asians, the Hong Kongers, the Chinese, would in terms of social behavior. Lastly, as I mentioned, earlier on, I graduated in the height of the crisis. 2008 was crazy. It was pretty scary. It changed the way finance, operated. Less is more. You have to be more efficient per head count now, because regulation controls, the cost of risk management has increased in that sense. So when we looked at this, we put it to COVID-19, the coronavirus in that sense. Within our partner network, and as a startup, we collaborate a lot in that sense. Some partners are completely devastated. They are shut down. They can't move, especially the ones that are not digital enough. We work with some remittance players, money changers, who still rely on that physical branch. And when it shut down, right, it just goes to zero overnight, which was very scary. So we saw an accelerated interest, to integrate to something more digital, to something more innovative in that sense. So we are seeing that right now. We are seeing some of our partners in the e-grocery space, 10x, increase their volumes by 10 times in the last 3 weeks, which was surprising, considering before that they were breaking even only. Now they are highly profitable in that sense.
Right.
But we don't just look at short term, right? I think social behaviors will change, finance will change. Certain industries will not be around. Some of these industries that we are looking at are essentially the food industries, who are food manufacturers in that sense, like the farmers, like us, right? Like me before in that sense. The workers who work in these industries, these are all the champions and all the winners that we need to pick. And these industries, they will all survive going forward.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, because for me, right, I always just feel as if so much of what we hear about and read about in traditional media, it's obviously very U.S. and Europe or Western world focused, and definitely in the past couple of weeks, especially data that comes out of China, it's kind of tough to really ascertain whether or not it's accurate. And so to that end, I've always been quite curious to sort of hear what people on the ground are seeing within their respective regions and their respective industries. And so for me, Southeast Asia has always been pretty opaque, given the fact that so many of these economies and countries are, as you said, developing, and obviously there's a language barrier as well too. But what are some interesting takeaways, sort of to expand on your point about your experience with vendors that you guys have been seeing just on your platform? What are some things that you feel as if are being a little bit misrepresented or aren't exactly accurate with just generally held beliefs at the moment? with regards to Southeast Asia? I mean, you can
Well,
go
I think,
generally. It could even be, by country.
yeah,
I'm just super, super curious.
I think, I think the candid portion would be, when we have a certain set of hubris, shortcuts, right? When we think Thailand, oh, the Thai people are happy-go-lucky people, that means they are lazy, you know, or same thing, Malays in Malaysia, um, because of affirmative action from the government for 60 years, the Malays are not hardworking enough, and it's the Chinese that built out Southeast Asia. You know, while there are some truths in those things, but Southeast Asians in that sense, like the Thais, they might not be that hardworking, but honestly, they are very efficient. They are shrewd. So you need when you come in, you work with Thais in a sense. In my experience, sometimes you need to read in between the lines, especially when you go to Thailand in a sense. And we support a Thai, our developers are, my CTO are Thais, and we do business in Thailand also in that sense. When we look at Malaysia, for example, you need to be closer. You need to know who's who in the government. Sometimes the royal families in that sense, to pull certain connections or strings to actually go in. But having said that, pure hustling will work. It depends on how hard that you're going to go at it in that sense. And of course, sometimes we have to say luck, timing, all plays a part. I think one of the key things that people also gets or gets wrong about Southeast Asia, as I mentioned earlier on, they think Southeast Asia is one homogeneous place. We will think that, oh yeah, maybe people are different for sure. But doing business, if I have a great product, if it works for Singapore, it will work for, say, Indonesia, for example. Unfortunately, this is not true, and that's why I would say, hyper localization, understanding cultures deeply, spending time with local people, like what you have done in a sense, those are the things that will actually help get a better understanding of what this place is all about.
Got it. And specific to your point about about hyper localization, like what are sort of some examples of what you guys have been doing specifically? I'm just really curious to sort of see and understand that a little bit better, and also, with regards to the current crisis. I mean, are you seeing any very interesting specific data points or bits of information that kind of just has led you to come to new conclusions or different conclusions about things?
I think unfortunately, in terms of data points that are interesting, wow. I mean, for us, we supported a lot of. So okay, one point, I think a lot of these SMEs, small business enterprises that we support, they are really resilient. When this crisis happened, we support a lot of traditional industries by means of loans. We do remittances for their workers and all that. And we know businesses shut down. Workers are furloughed, they are not paid and all that. Somehow, some of our partners actually went to source for Chinese products, masks, PPEs, gloves, and all that. So from remitting for their workers, we actually started doing B2B payments for medical supplies. I mean, we are, if we want to be a bank, and I want to go back to be a banker, we are service industry. We are the pillar of support in terms of giving, financial liquidity, efficiency, from a technological point of view and a liquidity point of view for our players, for our partners in that sense. So one of these key things was that I think 70% of our partners started to trade some form of medical supplies, from RNA test kits, RNA test kits, gloves, masks, some even ventilators in that sense, all across the region, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. And that's how they survive, right? That's how they keep, their workers, efficiently in that sense. Of course, there are a bunch of people who just like to be shut down. I'll stay at home. I don't want to do anything. I cry about it. There are people like that in our ecosystem. We can't help them much, right? Because they're not evolving with the times. I mean, good friend of mine, just this morning, they were trading like 50,000 boxes of masks from China to Indonesia. Somehow they gotten a contract from the government to do that, and they are not price gouging. It's a fair price from the way we see it. And previously, what this guy was doing, he was doing e-commerce. He was doing e-commerce. He was selling drop shipping and all these things, and suddenly booms. I look to trade B2B masks in that sense. One of the very sad data points that we see, unfortunately, is a total collapse of remittances from migrant workforce. It is what it is. It's very sad because already these guys are not earning a great living. On
Right.
average, they probably earn about 500 US a month. Some much lower than average of 500. And they live hand to mouth, and not just they. Their villages, the family. The culture of these migrant workers is usually, one people come out to work, and maybe 5 to 10 people are waiting for their salary at home.
Mhm.
We saw a total collapse of migrant remittances. These are some of the sadder points that we see. We actually saw an uptick in the loans that we are providing. Again, we're very careful. Of course, we are a small startup. We try to support to survive, at least at this
Right.
point. And most of these loans, are from the way we see it, if we are fighting against the virus and all that, that's something that we would support, and extend an olive branch. We are seeing donations settled on our network also, where we don't charge a fee actually. So we actually see all this happening in these times. So, consumer demand has died down for sure, right? Consumer confidence has died down. The ones that will survive are the ones that evolve fast, go with the times, and this is where we plug into support in that sense.
Got it. You bring up a good point about the migrant workers, because one of the themes that I've definitely been thinking quite a bit about, especially in the past, let's say 2 to 3 weeks, has been, I guess, just an overall complacency, or almost the expectation that things are going to be better from here on out. Obviously, for me personally, I'm definitely an optimist, by nature. However, having lived through whether it was 2008 or whether it was, SARS back in the day when I was in high school, or whether it was more recently, as you and I both know, going through the crypto bear market, complacency is dangerous, right? And, I just want to sort of get your sense of what you think about that issue. You brought up migrant workers. Obviously, I think Singapore right now has this whole scare, this COVID scare that is very much centered around migrant worker dorms. And, that brings into question, well, what about all these countries that these migrant workers are from, right? And how are they going to be affected by COVID? Indonesia has seen cases continue to grow. Nobody's really talking about that. There's India as well, too. And as we know, all of these countries, unlike a lot of the other Western countries and developed countries that have had to deal with this, have very, very wobbly health systems at best. So I'm keen to know what your take is on this bigger macro question.
To bring up a good point, to add on to your point, Myanmar for the longest of time, for the past 3 months, kept saying that there's zero coronavirus, there's zero infectious case over there, because of some lifestyle that the Burmese will live, and therefore our immunity is higher and all that. And today, one of the key reasons that we see, developing countries, healthcare is not there, comparative to the West, right? The health infrastructure is there. It might be old, but it's there, right? So for the longest of time, we feel, or I feel, that hey, if there's no infrastructure there, or lack of infrastructure, or supremely frugal infrastructure, there is nothing to report in that sense, right? A lot of people are complaining Singapore's numbers is very high. We are actually number one in Southeast Asia right now, per capita and by per number in that sense. About 8,000, I think, today, and we have been growing about 500-600 on average on a day-to-day basis. So where's the difference in that sense, right? I think for a lot of us, we all know testing is the numbers that we see is a function of testing. The available of tests that is done per capita for Singapore, we have done more tests than any of the countries in Southeast Asia in that sense. Contact tracing, number two, and of course we can do this because we are a small country. It's easy for us to mobilize certain, government resources and all that and carry these things out in that sense. So for us, the poorer nations, or the more developed nations, where healthcare is unfortunately not so developed, I would sometimes say, maybe it was just totally overlooked in that sense. And therefore, there's a huge gap, for the migrant workers, because when these things happen, we know sometimes some of these cases in a neighboring country of ours, they send everybody home without tests, without support. Also in the same countries, we feel that their national workers were working in Singapore. They don't allow them to come back to Malaysia, unless you have gotten a test, a negative test from the Singapore government to do that. The Singapore government doesn't test, any Tom, Dick, and Harry. They test when you go through clinical recommendations in that sense. And yet we test the most per capita in that sense. So when you don't allow your nationals to come back, there's a little bit of a double standards. We already know that supplies are limited in that sense. So this group of people, the migrant workers, they are really, really in a very, very hard place where there is no support from some of their national countries. There is no infrastructure in some of these countries that they work in. And lo and behold, they are the ones fighting it for themselves in that sense. So you can't blame them when cases go up, for a lack of infrastructure in that sense.
Yeah. For me, that continues to be one of the main reasons why I continue to think that a lot of these developing countries, and we'll just stick to Southeast Asia for now, and the ASEAN region, why there's so much more negative news and negative data that has yet to be shown and may not ever come out in official figures, right? Until we really sort of see whether it's corporate earnings, whether it's unemployment, things sort of lagging indicators come out further down the line, precisely because of that, right? You mentioned a lot of these countries don't have the infrastructure to even record data and to report data, and so how can you be so optimistic that okay, well, the worst is behind us, right? I've been talking a lot to a lot of different friends about what they're seeing on the ground, just because for me it's so important to get a more accurate picture of what's actually happening. There's these talking heads on CNBC, Bloomberg, CNN, what have you, right? And everybody's talking about, excuse my language, but fucking V-shaped recovery. And to me, it's a little bit foolish to expect and to think that that's going to happen. Obviously, I hope that there will be less pain going forward and that things do end up recovering a lot faster than I expect. But it's just hard to when you actually look at situations on the ground and you do a little bit of deductive reasoning, right? And yeah, I just think that a country like Indonesia, for example, I read one data point where they have less than 100 ventilators in the entire country. So sure, maybe there's not enough data or there hasn't been enough reports of new infections, but they're probably not testing much, right? And how do they actually have the ability and the systems in place to go out and record deaths, to go out and record infections? They don't. So that's one thing that definitely scares me, right? Is that sort of belief that things are going back to normal. And if you take a look at the U.S., right? I mean, sure, Trump wants to get the country back and running in May next month, but considering how they have botched this entire thing thus far, and knowing the relative inability for the American government to handle things properly with precision at scale, there's a lot of question marks as to reinfection wave two, right? And I think that Singapore is a great example. What was it, like a month ago? People didn't have to wear masks, and right, people thought the worst was behind us about a month ago, right?
Yep.
And it's definitely gotten a lot worse.
Yep. No, I think Singapore definitely, I think from a ground point of view, there's worth, maybe, our agencies, government agencies were complacent. We started to pat ourselves on the back. I mean, even Trump said that he advised Singapore, right? In that sense. So maybe it's a blessing for disguise for us that numbers actually went up. Not saying that it's great, but we can never be too careful. In that sense. In Chinese, there's always a saying, 小金石的万年船. Direct translation, it means that, if you are careful, your ship can sail 1,000 years in that sense. So I err to the side of caution for us, as I run, Shuttle One, as I conduct, my family's daily lives in that sense. We don't panic, we keep calm in the storm. But we do see a lot of people, being complacent, right? They take things for granted. Maybe it's just the way that they were taught. Maybe capital was a little bit too easy in the last 10 years or so, right? We see that in the crypto space, right? We all know 90% of projects that we invest in are going to go up in flames, but we still did that, for whatever reasons in that sense, and that's complacency in that sense. I think in the light of this crisis, you mentioned, it's not going to be V-shaped. I agree with you, because I think even if stimulus comes in, people will be cautious to actually spend now. I mean, imagine looking at, big nationals, corporations going up in flames, bankrupt and all that. If multi-billion dollars of business can be wiped out in a month, the guy holding on to $500, $1,002 in the US, would actually rather save those money up in that sense.
Yeah, and I think especially with so many Southeast Asian countries being very commodity dependent, it's an interesting day that we're talking about commodities, given the fact that I'm sure everybody in the past 24 hours has heard about oil going negative. That's another headwind, right? That's another uncertainty. And for me, when I think about forming a view and putting my investor hat on and thinking about risk, that's another unknown, right? Is how a lot of these Southeast Asian countries deal with this commodity price cratering, right? I mean, sure, one can argue it's just oil, oil is not the be all and end all of commodities, but I think a lot of the reasoning and a lot of the mechanics that were behind the oil price drop, namely demand drop, you can see that expressed, and you can see that happening in a lot of different commodities, right? Whether it's hard or soft. So that's another risk that I'm also thinking about as well too.
I think my views on commodities is slightly an add-on to that. While consumer demand will always be the king, I think commodities or food, I might not be that great for metals and other things. I've always thought it to be a distribution problem in that sense. Market forces commodities to go to the highest payer, in that sense. Adding on to adding steroids to that, derivatives and all these things that are just going, making market going 3 or 4 times more. I think that's great financial innovation, but again, from what we saw yesterday, right, a historic drop to the negatives, to minus $30 per barrel of oil. for May delivery. Of course, that's futures again, but I think structurally we got to see how distribution is being done. For all the oil that we're going to throw away, for all the food that we're going to throw away, there are still people hungry. There are people without energy. It's a matter of distribution, and a matter of distribution requires public and private partnerships that get things done in that sense. Too many times, that politics and people politics in general gets in the way. I debate with you for too much. I want to express my view, but while expressing our views, we are wasting, goddamn time to provide some of this aid, food, energy to some of these places that we really need it to be. So I do hope that governments will actually look into better distribution lines that will be more equitable. We need to rethink, monetary policies in a sense. We need to rethink classical Keynesian economics, where it rewards, I won't say I'm a socialist, but it rewards the capitalists for the risk that is taken in that sense, right?
Yeah.
We need to put back sociology and social ideas in that space, and really, build up some of these communities to be resilient in the longer term.
Yeah, for sure. And so to that point, how do you think? Well, how do you see things shaking out, right? Specifically, just let's say, for example, to your industry, how do you envision, let's just say, the general industry's roadmap for the next, 1 to 5 years, let's say, given what's happening?
I think fintech, from our products, remittance will be still the cutthroat industry. There will be a more, I think we'll see a consolidation of companies who are not that efficient, who are burning too much, in that sense. For us, we have always really been 3 men from 2 years ago. We were very careful. We automate everything that we can in finance. I think that's one, because remittances will crash in my opinion. And I think from a domestic transfer point of view, that would be where the market is. But domestic transfers for most countries are already free. Nobody charges a fee for domestic transfers in that sense. So loans, in the short run, I think the next 18 months, we will compete with government stimulus. There will be really nothing to show to compete with a 1%, annum interest. And possibly if it's in the US, loan forbearance, the loans get wiped off if you keep your employees, in your enterprise in that sense. Private, fintechs who deal with loans, they can't compete in that, right? But I think if you're able to survive the 18 months, I'm sure you will come back, you will bounce back in that sense. But I do think, personal finance, innovative solutions that gets better use because of whatever risk, that is acceptable and adequate, I think that will be a huge innovation in the space.
Got it. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that too. Just in terms of how a lot of these existing players survive, and just for my education, what's the current climate like for remittance, let's say? I mean, obviously there's Western Union, a lot of the legacy old non-digital players per se that charge something between like 7 to 9% per transaction. That's crazy, right? I mean, and then that's sort of the legacy players on one side, and then on the other side you have guys like yourselves who are the new kids on the block and who are really starting to, I guess, just only now become visible. Are there any middle players, and then if so, what percentage of the market do they hold? How do you see just things changing, like the whole market structure changing?
I think as with most industries, anybody in the middle, if you don't change or survive, you're gonna shut down, right? Nobody does well being in the middle. It's either you are the small guy taking a lot of risk, or you are already there as a big guy, defending the risk in that sense. So I think the Western unions, the MoneyGrams, the the TransferWise, they're all going to be around. Having said that, give it up to Western Union, TransferWise. While most people think that they are expensive, inefficient, which is clearly the hubris again in that sense. I would say Western Union and TransferWise, they are pretty efficient. Whether they make money or not, we are not sure, right? But of course, with their big, huge forex balance sheet, I think they are able to withstand the storms and all that in that sense. For the guys in the middle, if we don't or you don't work together, adopt new technologies, new ways and bold ways of changing how finance is run, then I think you are in some serious shit.
Who are some of these people? Just to name a few, because
I would
for me, I actually put TransferWise. Well, I think of TransferWise a little bit differently from from Western Union, but it's interesting you sort of group them in the same category. Who are some of the middle players? Would you say?
This could be the banks as we know it, the banks that does remittances businesses in that sense. We know of a bank in the region, pretty big bank. They wanted to sell their whole remittance business for less than 15 million US.
15.
15, yeah. But of course, the capital that you need for that, for your forex market, would look like maybe $150 million, right? So that's working capital. But to sell that business away, 15, it was incredulous for us in that sense, right? So some of these guys are maybe the banks. Some of these middle-sized guys are maybe the boutique remittance houses that are in Southeast Asia. The money changers that you will see in touristy areas, they might be one of these medium and small guys in that sense. So these are the guys that are very technology staff. They don't use technology for whatever processes or methodology or whatever their operations need be. Some still use Excel spreadsheets. We know that for a fact. So I feel that these guys are most at risk. Back to our analysis, when we looked at the COVID-19 situation, who are we gonna support? We're actually trying to support the people that has dropped revenues in 40 to 50%, but with an edge to adopt technologies. And on the other hand, of course, the ones that are doing very well in e-commerce, in digital payments and all that, cross-border transactions, those are the guys that we are supporting in that sense. But anywhere in between, I don't see survivability, right? Consumer confidence, 6 months to come back in a good rate in that sense, if not 2 years. The fact being that really a lot of these guys that has closed down, I would maybe say 50-60%, you won't see them anymore, which means there's a 50-60% drop in volume, in transactions, in income, in economy in that sense. So it's going to take some time for us to recover, but there will be winners, and to back these winners, for companies to be able to back the winners, they need to survive first in the next 6 to 8 months at least.
Yeah. Survival is is of the utmost importance. It's funny how we've just changed in a matter of a couple of months, no more than a quarter, right? From just euphoria and hubris to survival mode. I couldn't agree with you more on that point. I know we're coming up on time here, so I'm going to sort of get into a couple of sort of last rapid fire questions. But before we get into some of the parting stuff, what's the one area that you think, based upon where you're sitting, both from an industry perspective as well as geography, is the one area of myopia? What is something that you think the market or that the general population as a whole takes as truth or just assumes to be true, but that might not be, and where are they missing things?
And this might sound a little bit biased, but I'll say food cost, right?
Food costs.
Food costs, cost for food.
Food costs. Oh, okay, yeah, that's interesting. Sorry, go on.
So I I invest in agricultural stuff. I was a farmer before, and you know, chili prices around our region, and I know this for a fact. For many other products, you know, has never changed in the last 30 years, not from a wholesale point of view in that sense. So, and this crisis might be a first good wake up call for a lot of people who are trying to understand what entails your food costs in that sense, the food prices that you see at the end of the day. Right now, I'm a loaner. You know, we originate loans, you know, and we dish out loans. Unfortunately to say, you know, I will not support a farmer because the risk that he takes is just intense. You know, it's just crazy in that sense. I was lucky enough, you know, to be successful in a few rounds. So the thing is that, and I have no solutions for this. Maybe it's a public, you know, support on a global scale in that sense. The US does it very well, subsidies and all that. But that's caused because, you know, a lot of the, you know, the farming belt, the majority of the voters are there in that sense. For places that votes doesn't matter, you know, maybe in some parts of Southeast Asia, you know, the guy producing your food is not incentivized enough to produce for the next round, right? Everything is getting eaten up by factors of production, by problems with labor and distribution in that sense. So if the world is going more digital today, you know, where actually the farmer becomes closer to their food, it could just be one guy sending it to a warehouse and that warehouse, you know, sending it out. We like to talk about farm to table, but it has always been a myth in a sense. So I think supporting, you know, food producers from a technological, from a finance, and from a distribution point of view, logistical point of view, I think that is clearly needed in the light of this crisis. And food has always been one of these industries that has been overlooked in good times. It's only in unfortunately wartime, you know, like what Trump would like to say, that it becomes a little bit more magnified in that sense. But it is something that has always been there. And if it's something that is so crucial, we shouldn't be complacent again, you know, to be overlooking that industry. It needs a lot of support. You know, India, for example, there's so many farmers that committed suicide because wholesale prices are not great. But yet the food is delivered. Somebody is earning the bucks in between and passing on, you know, that cost to the consumer, like us, in that sense. So we need to really rethink.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to ask you. So when you said food costs, you're worried of a risk that food costs rise way more than anybody expects because of the difficulties you said.
Yep.
It's interesting you say that. Yeah. Like the last, I mean, the previous video chat that I did, you know, with a good friend of mine, he's a importer and distributor of fresh produce in China. He's an American guy, but he's lived in Beijing for 12 years, and you know, he imports mostly beef from South America, Australia, and I mean the food or the prices in cattle and beef and meat prices have just gone absolutely bananas. You know, massive wild swings, whether it was swine flu last year going into obviously this situation right now, the knock-on effects on beef. So yeah, it's an interesting thing that you say that because, you know, we all obviously need food, and that, you know, when people go hungry, those are the seeds for social unrest.
Yep. No, and exactly right there, you know, unfortunately one of our things you know, in our analysis was prolonged military action. You know, the guys that owns the guns controls the game, right? And if we as a world don't come together and support, you know, these are what you said, right? Swine flu, which increased, you know, pork prices in China, you know, unrest in Latin America. I'm sure, I know if he imports like berries and all that, there are only 2 or 3 companies in the world that dominates the whole supply chain for berries. Raspberry, blueberry, just 2 or 3 companies. Bananas, just 1 company, right? Yep. You know, these are crazy monopolies that if we talk about a free trade world or, you know, anti-competition or big tech, I think we should really talk about anti-competition for food. Who is really dominating the supply chains? No questions that they are great entrepreneurs, they build a great enterprise. But this is more than that. This is, you know, coming
survival.
Yeah. It's survival and it comes here. So one of our things in 3 years, if certain things don't happen, we see, Shuttle One sees prolonged military action. We see breakouts of unrest. We saw that in Hong Kong last year. You don't need a problem with food. And what makes you think that it's not going to happen again, right? We are seeing certain of these things, in the US right now. Hopefully not Southeast Asia. We don't see it here. But again, these problems are critical, not just specific to a region. It is the same throughout. So when we looked at supporting, food distributors. So one of our guys, as I mentioned earlier, they 10 times their volume. They are a food distributor. They were an online grocer. These are the guys that we are putting, our monies on the line to make sure certain of these things are still working effectively, in that sense. But in general, I think there needs to be a huge look into how food is produced, either more efficiently, getting distributed, rightly, with the right private and public partnerships in that sense. Singapore, for example, just put it simply, just 10 years ago when I started farming, the Singapore government's strategy was to diversify as many food sources as there is globally, which is a fair strategy. Give it to the government.
Security. That's right. You have to make sure that you have your food supply secured.
Of course. So the problem is, if you're not, the problem is, and I quote my ex-prime minister, the economic wars, the military wars of Singapore needs to be fought by Singaporeans, by the Singapore army, and not employing mercenaries in that sense. The same thing goes for economic war. If our economic war is not fought by our companies, run by our people, you're going to have a problem. People are going to exit, companies are going to lay off people and all that. And if we food, again, if we are not self-reliant, all right, and I think we are a little bit slow for Singapore because property prices are expensive, blah, blah, blah. It's only the fund. There's a $30 million food fund. That's been around for fucking ages. But there are nobody who goes for it because nobody knows how to farm. I didn't want to farm here because I know cost is going to be expensive. I can never compete with my friends, my neighbors in that sense, where I used to do business with, you see. So, but we still need to be reliant. How do we do that? I don't think private companies are going to come in, but how does the government incentivize entrepreneurs, to take on this task in that sense, you see? So I was a little bit surprised, because I always think that being self-reliant is a bit better. Being in-house, build things in-house is much better, more control, And with food, one of these most critical, I would say, factors for survivability is outsourced. I think it's a joke.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the model has definitely worked in the past several decades, but as you said, going forward, with political climates changing and also with different demand related shocks and sort of exogenous events like COVID, securing your own food supply is going to be super important, and that's another risk, right, that people aren't really factoring in, which is super interesting. Well, look, man, thanks for sharing your thoughts on all that. There's so many things I would love to get into a little bit more, but maybe we can revisit that again at a later date. But a couple of last quick fire questions for you. Speaking about food and being underrated or overrated, what's the most underrated Singaporean food that people should know more about, and what's the most overrated?
I think the most underrated. Wow, that's a great question, man. I think I only have one. The most underrated and the most overrated is chicken rice, right? Our Hainan Kai Fan, Hainan chicken rice. I think because it's so available, it's so widely available, that the locals think it's just like peasant food and all that. But for outsiders, for friends from overseas, it's like, wow, this is the best thing that happened. The chili is great. So I think the most underrated is chicken rice. Most overrated is chicken rice also.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there, man. Every time I go to Singapore, as you know, I think our last meal was actually at a chicken rice place, Boon Tong Kee, right? I mean, that's one of the institutions, but I love going to the hawker centers and trying out all the different chicken rice.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah, it
Oh,
can
yeah, no,
definitely roll. I see that. I see that. And last one, because you've been in so many different sectors and industries. What's the dumbest investment you've ever made?
wow. There's a lot. There's a lot. There's
Yeah,
a lot,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, for me too.
I I went with the hype, with the herd instinct. Invested in an exchange, in a crypto exchange that, on hindsight, I was complacent because we just feel, wow, this is gonna be like the gateway to crypto payments and all this stuff, right? But hindsight will have it that uh, it is the lousiest. I won't name the project, but when I look back, it was herd instinct. It was not being disciplined, being complacent, as we said. Yeah, so it was a crypto exchange. The exchange didn't materialize. They did issue tokens though, but who the fuck trades on it nowadays, right?
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. Yeah, for me, my dumbest investment is also in crypto. Um, to be honest, like to be honest with you right now, I can't even think about what specific one it is. I'm thinking about like three or four. But
Yeah.
yeah, again, right, herd mentality, sort of using traps of sort of what's worked in the past or what's worked in this short time frame, and yeah, complacency and lack of discipline. But
Yeah.
thanks, man. Really appreciate that. Let's
Thank
do
you.
it
Thank
again
you.
sometime.
Thank you, Alex. Take care, man.
Take care.